In this video, we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about what exactly a right is. The talk of rights, or the language of rights, is actually really pretty crucial for medical ethics. It's very closely related to some of the things that we talked about with regard to the principle of justice. And it's something that gets brought up quite often in the different discussions that we'll be engaging with in this course. So with that in mind, I do want to just briefly go over 5 different ways of kind of understanding what exactly is meant by a right. So first of all, we might think of rights as a kind of a moral right. And this would be a view of rights where rights are really quite fundamental. There's something sort of intrinsic that maybe a person has. We might say that a moral right is something that is had in virtue of being a person or in virtue of having a moral status. And so if you think of having a moral status as kind of belonging to the moral community, there's different ways we can cash that out. So if you're a utilitarian, for example, you might think that someone is a part of the moral community or has a moral status in virtue of having sentience, having the ability to experience pain and pleasure, suffering and happiness, sort of having the awareness of the world around you, right? And if you've got that, then you have a moral status, and you might have certain moral rights in virtue of that moral status, in virtue of being that kind of a person, that kind of a moral agent. In that sense, moral claims would apply to you because you have a moral status, and therefore you might have a kind of a fundamental moral right of some sort. You might also take a different view, what sometimes described as Kantian deontology view of morality. On that view, having a moral status would be something different. Being a part of the moral community or having a moral status might involve having the right kind of agency, rational agency. If you think that view is correct, well, then having a moral right would be something that a person has where persons are understood as rational agents, the ability to think about and comprehend and sort of direct your life in a certain way. If you're a fan of the first view, where having a moral status involves being sentient, then notice that not just human beings have a moral status, right? Maybe certain animals, maybe dolphins, maybe elephants, maybe pigs, maybe a dog or a cat. Maybe these sort of creatures, these non-human animals, have a moral status too. In which case, it might be thought that certain animals have certain kind of fundamental moral rights. That might seem somewhat strange, but if we think of moral rights as these sort of fundamental features of being a person or having a moral status, being a part of the moral community, then it looks like that's something that we should really take seriously. On the other hand, if you're a fan of the other view, Kantian deontology, that says, having a moral status requires being a rational agent, well, then it's not obvious that a cat or a dog or a pig is a rational agent. They might be able to experience pain, but they may not be able to understand pain as being a bad thing, in which case they may not have that kind of fundamental moral right that we normally attribute to rational agents like you or myself. So we might give an example of what a sort of moral right would look like, this sort of fundamental thing. So the example that I've got on the slide here is the right to self-determination, or sometimes described as the right to autonomy. We might also say something like the right to life. So for example, if you think that a human being that's a rational agent has the ability to decide what they want to do with their life. Maybe, they have the ability to reason and think through the projects and the things that they find most enjoyable, what they want their life to turn out like. Well, then maybe they have a fundamental right to self-determination in this way. On the other hand, if you think that something like a fetus, for example, doesn't have this sort of rational agency, doesn't have the ability to think through the projects that they want to engage with, well, then maybe a fetus doesn't have that kind of right to autonomy or self-determination. Likewise, you might think that the fetus has a right to life in virtue of having something like, a valuable future ahead of them. These are sort of different ways in which we can cash out the notion of a moral right as being a kind of a fundamental part of what it means to be a part of the moral community in general. Now, I also want to make clear that rights generally involve what's described as the correlative thesis, okay? And now this thesis says that any right entails a correlative obligation of others or on others, either not to interfere with one's liberty or to provide something like an entitlement. So we'll say a little bit more about what that's going to mean here in a minute. So legal rights. Somebody might think that rights really are these sort of legal things. They're not these deep fundamental things that, belong only to moral agents. Rather, legal rights are what we should be concerned with. and they're the only kind of rights that exist. Now, this is a very austere view of rights, sort of a minimalist approach. You might even say that there's a kind of a right to life, or maybe a right to self-determination or autonomy, but all other rights are basically just legal rights. Or you could say that legal rights are the only kind of rights that exist, and the way we would cash that out is if A has a right to X, that's simply in virtue of having some sort of a legal right. So A has a right to X if and only if it is specifically granted by some societies, by some law that's given in a society. In which case, all other rights in that sort of understanding, all other rights would just merely be rhetorical devices. That, again, that's a very austere view of rights, but it's one that maybe somebody might hold. So one famous philosopher, Jeremy Bentham, once said, "Rights are the child of law. From real laws come real rights. But from imaginary laws, from laws of nature, come imaginary rights." So the basic idea here is that this notion of rights are really just rhetorical devices. From imaginary laws come imaginary rights, and only from real laws, the laws that the society puts into place, would you get any kind of real rights. But again, they would be merely legal rights granted to you by the society, whatever institutions are governing that society. So that's another approach that we could take to the notion of rights. But we also might think of rights as in terms of what's sometimes called positive rights. So a positive right is a right that carries with it a correlative obligation to provide the individual who possesses the right with some sort of a benefit, right? Some good or some opportunity, some service. So you might think that if you have a right to healthcare, well, then there has to be some group of people that has an obligation to provide you that healthcare. Or if you think that there's a positive right to education, well, then there's got to be some group of people who are obligated to provide you with that opportunity of education, right? And so that's the notion of a positive right. We can spell that out in terms of saying that if A has a right to X, then Y, some group of individuals, Y has an obligation to provide A with X. Insofar as there's this obligation to provide a good or service or opportunity, then we sometimes call that welfare rights or entitlement rights. Now, another way that we can think about rights are in terms of negative rights. So a negative right is one that carries correlative obligations of non-interference. There's no obligation to provide anything else. There's just a right not to be interfered with. If you think that perhaps the right to own a gun is understood in terms of a negative right, well, then that means that you have the right to go out and purchase and own a gun, but nobody has a right to or an obligation to interfere with your ability to own the gun. Likewise, if you think that there's a negative right to healthcare, then you have the opportunity, you have the ability, the access to go get healthcare, and nobody has an obligation or a right to interfere with your ability to get healthcare. And so in that sense, we can cash that kind of negative right out in terms of the following. If A has a negative right to X, no one should prevent A from pursuing X. So in that sense, we sometimes describe that kind of a right, this negative right, in terms of liberty rights. You have the right to pursue certain things. You have the right to go and get certain things. You have the right to sort of express your freedoms in certain ways, and nobody can prevent you from doing that. There's an obligation of non-interference with these kind of negative rights. Another way to think about rights, though, are in terms of ideal rights. Now, this is kind of an interesting way of thinking about rights. Here we would say that an ideal right is a sort of a statement of societal moral ideals. If a society thinks that there are certain moral ideals that should be put in place, then they endorse those, right? It's a statement that the society thinks is something we should try to achieve, we should aim for, but they're not going to be the sort of things that involve any obligations on anyone. These are sort of moral ideals that don't entail any correlative duties or obligations by anyone. Some examples we might think of is actually the Declaration of Human Rights by the United Nations. This is, I think, an interesting example because you can think of human rights in terms of these ideal rights or idealized rights. They're the sort of rights, the sort of things that each society should strive for. They should be aiming for, the kind of moral claims, moral statements, or ideals that apply to individuals. And each society should be aiming to make those available and possible for each individual. But they don't involve any correlative duties or obligations on any particular society. And so, one question we might ask is, well, what about healthcare? Is healthcare a kind of an ideal right in this sense? It's an idealization, something that each society should be striving for, but there are no obligations on anyone to provide this as entitlement or as a kind of a benefit or a good? That's an interesting question, something that I want you all to kind of keep in mind as we engage with these different issues in this course. And so that wraps up our brief little discussion of rights. There's obviously much more that could be said, but this at least kind of gets your feet wet with regard to the different ways in which we sometimes talk about rights.